I think most of us grow up with this idea of what free speech is or where it comes from.
Right.
It's always some heroic moment, isn't it? A flash of enlightenment, a big declaration, or maybe, I don't know, some dusty old parchment.
The Magna Carta. Everyone always points to the Magna Carta.
Exactly, that's the one, especially when you're looking at the history of the UK.
And look, if we're going to do a deep dive here, we have to start by, well, just tearing up that whole script.
Yeah.
Because British free speech is not this neat, linear story. It doesn't flow naturally from the Magna Carta. In fact, if you scratch beneath the surface, the story is, it's much messier, it's far more accidental, and frankly, a bit cynical.
All right, so let's unpack that. We've got this stack of sources here, and they seem to document a history where the right to speak freely was actually resisted by power at every turn.
It was.
So our mission today is to follow that winding path and figure out how expression went from being this tightly controlled danger to the state to the very conditional right it is today.
And the core insight, the thing we really want you to leave with is this. British free speech is not the product of a heroic founding document. It wasn't a flash of philosophical genius.
Right.
It emerged slowly, unevenly, and often by accident. It was shaped by political conflict, by institutional convenience. It is fundamentally a byproduct of power learning to tolerate criticism.
But only when it had to.
Only when it was politically necessary, and never, ever more than was strictly required.
Okay, so if the Magna Carta wasn't the starting gun for free speech for everyone, where do we actually find the first legal protection for speech?
This is what's so fascinating. The earliest recognizable protection for speech in England wasn't for the general public at all.
Not for the people.
No. It was entirely internal to the governing structure. It started as something called parliamentary privilege, a right for the political class, not for the everyday citizen.
A right for rulers, not the ruled. I mean, that's a huge paradox right out of the gate.
Yeah.
So what was the argument for it? Why did members of parliament need this special shield?
It was purely pragmatic. The argument was pretty simple, really. How could they possibly advise the crown honestly or debate policy if they were constantly afraid of being arrested or fined the moment they stepped outside the chamber?
So an MP could stand up, criticize the king's new tax policy, and the king could just have him thrown in the Tower of London.
Exactly. The fear of reprisal was immediate. It was palpable. Imagine trying to have a real critical debate about national security when one wrong word could mean you lose your head.
Or at least your fortune.
Right. So the protection wasn't about some abstract philosophical liberty. It was a functional necessity to make sure the government could actually, govern.
And eventually this internal, very specific privilege gets formalized.
It does. It gets written down in the political settlement after the Glorious Revolution. We're talking about the Bill of Rights of 1689. And the language they used tells you everything.
What did it say?
It stated that the freedom of speech in debates or proceedings in Parliament ought not to be impeached or questioned in any court or place out of Parliament.
The limits are built right into the text. In Parliament.
In Parliament and out of Parliament. That's the boundary line.
The crucial line.
It is. This moment created a protected bubble for legislators inside a specific building for the specific job of governance. It was never intended to be a general right for you or me to publish a scathing newspaper article about the government.
It's a tool of statecraft.
A practical shield against the king's power, not a universal human right.
So that's the story inside Westminster. But what about outside? What was life like for the average person on the street who dared to speak up?
Outside Parliament, the state viewed speech not as something to protect, but as a danger to be managed. For centuries, expression was tightly, systematically criminalized. The list of offenses was just vast.
And it was all designed to protect the established order.
Every single layer of it. The monarch, the government, the church, the aristocracy.
Okay, so let's break some of those down. What were we looking at?
Well, first, to protect the state, you had seditious libel. That just meant criticizing the government or the monarch. So if you wrote a pamphlet suggesting the king was incompetent,
That's a crime.
that's a crime. Then you had offenses to protect the church. Blasphemy, which was criticizing the Church of England, and heresy, holding the wrong religious views.
And then there's my personal favorite from the sources, just for the sheer arrogance of it.
Ah, yes, scandalum magnatum.
It sounds less like a crime and more like, I don't know, a private injury lawsuit for the super rich.
That's exactly what it was. It meant speech that harmed the reputation of the powerful, the magnates. It let nobles and bishops prosecute anyone who published slander against them. It basically said, you can't just be punished for the content, you're punished for the audacity of daring to talk about me at all.
This is all incredibly repressive. But this is where we hit what the sources call the most disruptive fact. Under all these laws, truth was often not a defense.
That's the crucial insight. It's what really separates the British tradition from, say, later American ideas.
Mm-hmm.
If you criticize the crown, and everything you said was demonstrably, factually true.
You had proof. The king did mismanage the navy.
You had proof. You could still be punished.
Wait, you could be punished for telling the truth.
Absolutely. Because you weren't being punished for being factually wrong. You were being punished for being disruptive, for weakening the reverence people were supposed to have for the crown.
So the state philosophy was devastatingly simple.
It was. Speech is dangerous, unless it actively serves the established order.
Which means the state was never concerned with the search for truth, just with the impact of the speech, the potential for instability.
Exactly. It was all about preserving state control and elite reputation.
Okay, so let's bring technology into this, because the popular story is that the printing press comes along and just blows the doors off censorship, right? Liberation for all.
And our sources show the complete opposite happened. The printing press triggered a panic.
More control, not less.
Far more control. Before printing, controlling information was, relatively easy. But now you could spread ideas rapidly, especially ideas critical of the church and state. This was in the 16th and 17th centuries. The state had to redouble its efforts.
So what did they do? What were these new control mechanisms?
They implemented something called prior restraint, basically stopping the speech before it could even happen.
Oh.
Printers needed licenses just to operate, all controlled by a tiny group of officials. Books had to be pre-approved by censors before they could be published. And unauthorized presses, they were ruthlessly tracked down, destroyed, and the authors and publishers jailed.
And the main tool for this was the Licensing of the Press Act.
That was the big one. It was an institutionalized system designed to ensure conformity. If you think of expression as water, the Licensing Act was the state trying to put a massive, heavy lid on the entire system.
So when does that lid finally come off? Surely at some point the ideals of the Enlightenment or just the sheer volume of printed stuff forces their hand.
This is where that story of accidental evolution really comes into focus. The act lapsed in 1695. But, and this is the crucial part, it did not lapse because Parliament suddenly read John Locke and had a philosophical conversion.
It wasn't an Enlightenment moment.
Not in the slightest. It lapsed because of a whole bunch of really pragmatic, non-ideological reasons. First, the censorship was just becoming impractical.
Too hard to enforce.
Way too hard. Imagine trying to police every tiny secret printing press in the country. It was too costly, too cumbersome. It was like trying to plug a million leaks with only 10 fingers.
So the state failed at censorship. It didn't choose freedom.
Precisely. And secondly, and maybe this is even more important, political self-interest killed it. By the late 17th century, Parliament was dominated by these warring factions, the Whigs and the Tories.
Right.
So when one faction was out of power, they suddenly realized they desperately needed a free press for themselves so they could criticize the faction that was in power.
So they dismantled the state's censorship machine because they wanted to use it against their rivals.
Yeah.
Not because they thought some random pamphleteer deserved the right to speak freely.
That's the entire story. The expansion of speech happened by friction and political convenience, not by principle. It was a functional failure of control, not a moral victory for freedom.
That is a really crucial point for you to grasp. Because if the state didn't get rid of these controls out of principle in 1695, it means those old laws criminalizing speech must have stuck around for a very, very long time.
They did. And the timeline here is genuinely shocking when you compare it to the popular story of British liberty. We're not talking about the 18th or 19th centuries here. We're talking about laws that survived well into the 21st century.
Okay, give us those dates. They really bring home how long this process took.
Let's take seditious libel, the crime of criticizing the government. After centuries of use, it wasn't formally abolished in the UK until 2009.
2009. That's yesterday in historical terms. That's incredible. So you're saying if you wrote a really critical blog post about the government in, say, 2005, you could theoretically have been charged under this ancient law.
Theoretically, yes. And it gets better. Blasphemy. The laws criminalizing criticism of the church. Those survived until 2008.
2000.
These laws, which treat opinion as a crime, were on the books for most of our lifetimes.
That persistence really separates the British experience from, say, the U.S. First Amendment. The UK never had that big moment where it just declared speech is free unless we say otherwise.
Exactly. The enduring British pattern right up to today is that speech may be tolerated as long as it doesn't cross these ill-defined lines of disruption or public safety. It never starts with a positive declaration of freedom. It starts with an assumption of necessary restraint.
Which brings us to today, the modern legal position. And given this history, it makes perfect sense that Britain still doesn't have a freestanding, absolute right to free speech.
It is not. When people in the UK claim they have a right to free speech, what they're actually referring to is a highly qualified conditional right, and one that was formalized pretty recently, and mainly through external influence.
You're talking about European human rights law coming into the UK system.
That's right. Freedom of expression was finally formalized through Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which was brought into domestic law through the Human Rights Act in 1998.
But it's not a simple declaration.
Not at all. The article provides protection, but it's immediately subject to a very, very long list of exemptions.
This is where the state keeps its power to manage and balance that right against other interests. So what's on that list? What can speech be limited for?
It's an exhaustive list. The right to expression is subject to measures necessary for national security, for public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime,
Okay.
for the protection of health or morals, and crucially, for the protection of the reputation or the rights of others.
That list is so broad. National security, public safety, morals, reputation. Doesn't that basically give the state a toolkit of excuses to intervene whenever speech gets inconvenient?
Well, that's the critical question, isn't it? Unlike systems that demand an extremely high bar for limiting speech, the structure of Article 10 embeds a process of necessary balancing.
So it's always a trade-off.
In the UK tradition, speech is always something to be weighed against those other social interests. It's never presumed to be untouchable. It's always contingent on context.
So the history we've tracked here, from an accidental privilege for MPs through centuries of criminalization to a modern right that's just riddled with exemptions, it all points to the same conclusion.
It does. In Britain, freedom of expression is treated as a conditional commodity.
You have to adjust your expectations. Understanding this history changes how you even see the concept. It's not this guarantee carved in stone.
It's a negotiated tolerance, a tolerance that has to constantly survive being weighed against public order, national security, and reputation.
That journey, from a tool for the powerful to a heavily constrained public right, it really shows the state's deep institutional resistance to the whole idea of unfettered disruptive speech.
And if we connect all this history to today, it leaves us with one final thought for you to mull over. The sources note that this conditional nature of British speech, the fact that it must always be balanced, it isn't necessarily a flaw.
What is it then?
It's an active, conscious choice. It's a choice the UK tradition has made to prioritize social order and reputation over uninhibited expression.
A negotiated tolerance. That's often talked about in public as if it's an absolute right. The implications of rarely acknowledging that choice openly. That's something to really keep in mind as you navigate all the conversations around free speech today.